There was a time when the flow of global wealth didn't pass through Wall Street, or London, or even Europe. It passed through cities of gold, knowledge, and power. From Baghdad to Córdoba, from Cairo to Samarkand. A time when the Islamic world wasn't just participating in global finance, it was leading it, commanding it, shaping the very rules of how money moved across civilizations. But how did this happen? How did a region once seen as the periphery of the ancient world become the undisputed center of global commerce? And more importantly, why did it disappear? These are the questions we're going to answer today. Because this isn't just a story about the past. It's a story about how financial power is built, how it is lost, and what that means for the world we live in right now. In the 7th century, something extraordinary began. Not just a military expansion, not just a religious movement, something far more consequential in the long run. As Islamic civilization expanded across continents, it didn't just conquer land, it connected the world. Think about what that means for a moment. For thousands of years, human civilizations existed in relative isolation. Trade happened, yes, but it was fragmented, unreliable, dangerous. What changed in the 7th century was the emergence of a unified cultural, legal, and commercial framework that stretched from the Iberian Peninsula in the west all the way to the borders of India in the east. We're talking about a territory larger than the Roman Empire at its peak. And unlike many empires that merely extracted resources from conquered lands, this civilization built something different. It built infrastructure for exchange, roads, caravanserais, resting places for merchants traveling thousands of miles, ports, legal institutions that protected contracts across borders. From the Iberian Peninsula to India, a vast network emerged. But this wasn't just an empire of territory. It was an empire of trade. Goods, ideas, and wealth flowed freely across thousands of kilometers. And for the first time in recorded history, a truly interconnected economic system began to take shape. Not just regional markets tied together by force, but a genuine, voluntary, trust-based global economy. At the center of this economic system was something revolutionary. Something that sounds simple, but was, in practice, one of the most sophisticated financial tools of the ancient world. A stable, trusted currency, the gold dinar. Now, to understand why this mattered, you have to understand the chaos that existed before it. In the early medieval world, currencies were fragmented, inconsistent, and constantly debased. A merchant traveling from one city to another might encounter 5 or 6 different currencies, each with different gold content, each accepted at different rates, each subject to manipulation by local rulers desperate for revenue. The result was economic friction on a massive scale. Trade was slowed, trust was eroded, deals collapsed. The dinar changed all of that. Unlike many fragmented currencies of the time, the dinar brought consistency. It had a standardized weight, a standardized purity, and it was recognized and respected across an enormous geographic area. Merchants could trade across regions without fear of unstable value. They knew what a dinar was worth in Baghdad. They knew what it was worth in Córdoba. They knew what it was worth in Cairo. This created something powerful, something that every financial system, ancient or modern, depends on absolutely: trust. And in finance, trust is everything. Without trust, markets freeze. Without trust, investments disappear. Without trust, economic growth grinds to a halt. The dinar gave the Islamic world something priceless. A foundation of trust on which an entire financial civilization could be built. But this was only the beginning. The Islamic world didn't just trade, it innovated. And when I say innovated, I don't mean incremental improvements. I mean fundamental breakthroughs, the kind that changed the nature of commerce itself. Centuries before European banks began to develop sophisticated financial instruments, the Islamic world had already created them. Early forms of checks, credit systems, partnerships with complex profit-sharing arrangements, insurance-like mechanisms to protect merchants against loss at sea. These weren't crude, primitive tools. They were sophisticated, legally codified financial instruments, backed by centuries of jurisprudence and commercial practice. One of the most important was the sakk, the origin of the modern word check. The sakk was, at its core, a written order for payment. A merchant in Baghdad could issue a sakk and have it honored by a business partner in Basra without a single coin ever physically changing hands. Think about what this meant. Before the sakk, a merchant traveling 1,000 miles had to carry physical gold. That gold was heavy. It was dangerous. It attracted thieves. And if your caravan was robbed, you lost everything. The sakk solved all of that. It allowed merchants to travel without carrying physical gold. Think about that. A financial system based not on weight, but on credibility, on reputation, on trust, on the strength of a written promise backed by law. Sound familiar? It should, because that is, at its core, exactly how the modern banking system works. When you write a check, when you make a wire transfer, when you use a credit card, you are operating within a system whose intellectual roots trace back to the bazaars and trading houses of the medieval Islamic world. But what truly made this financial system unstoppable wasn't just the money. It wasn't just the currency or the instruments or the trade routes. It was something deeper. It was knowledge. Cities like Baghdad didn't just become wealthy, they became wise. The House of Wisdom in Baghdad was perhaps the greatest intellectual institution the medieval world had ever seen. Scholars from across the known world gathered there. Muslims, Christians, Jews, Zoroastrians, Hindus, translating, debating, expanding the sum total of human knowledge. Mathematics evolved. Algebra was born. The word itself comes from Arabic. Accounting systems grew more sophisticated. Double-entry bookkeeping principles were understood and applied. Economic thought deepened. Concepts like risk-sharing, profit-loss partnerships, and contractual obligation were refined and codified over generations. This wasn't accidental. It was the result of a civilization that believed deeply in the value of knowledge, and that understood, at a fundamental level, the connection between learning and prosperity. This created a new kind of economy, one driven not only by trade, but by intelligence, by the systematic application of ideas to the problem of creating and distributing wealth. And it gave the Islamic world a competitive advantage that would last for centuries. By the 10th century, the reach of Islamic trade had become almost impossible to overstate. These were not regional merchants making occasional journeys to neighboring cities. These were global operators, sophisticated businessmen who navigated vast distances, complex legal systems, and radically different cultures, with confidence because they had the tools to do it. By the 10th century, Islamic trade networks stretched across Africa, where gold, ivory, and enslaved people moved in vast quantities. Asia, where spices, textiles, and precious stones from India, China, and Southeast Asia entered the global market. Europe, where Islamic merchants were often the only reliable source of luxury goods that European elites desperately wanted. Spices from India, gold from the kingdoms of West Africa, silk from China, porcelain, paper, and gunpowder, all flowing through Islamic-controlled routes. All of it passed through the hands and the markets of Islamic traders. This made the region the financial heart of the known world. If you wanted to trade globally in the 10th century, you had to go through them. You had to deal in their currency. You had to respect their contracts. You had to engage with their financial system. There was no alternative. The Islamic world was not just a participant in global trade. It was the gatekeeper, the clearinghouse, the central node through which the entire global economy passed. Now, here's something that often gets overlooked in discussions of Islamic economic history, and it's crucial. Finance in this tradition wasn't just about profit. It wasn't purely transactional. It was guided by principles, deep, carefully developed ethical principles about what money is for and what it is not for. One of the most well-known is the prohibition of riba, often translated as usury or excessive interest. The idea was simple but profound. You cannot simply lend money and collect interest without bearing any of the risk. If you want to profit, you have to participate. You have to share in the outcome, both the gains and the losses. This principle led to innovative financial structures. Musharaka, partnership arrangements where investors shared profits and losses proportionally. Mudarabah, where one party provided capital and another provided labor and expertise, and they split the results. These weren't just ethical niceties. They were structural features of the economy that shaped how wealth was created and distributed. Wealth circulation was seen as essential. A rich merchant who hoarded his gold, who refused to put it to productive use, was not celebrated. Investment, partnership, risk-sharing, these were the marks of a good economic actor. This created a more balanced economic structure. Not perfect, of course. No human system ever is, but fundamentally different from the extractive, debt-driven models that would later come to dominate the world. Part 7, The Beginning of Decline. But no empire lasts forever. And no financial system, however sophisticated, is immune to the forces of history. By the 11th and 12th centuries, cracks were beginning to appear. Internal divisions fractured the political unity that had made the trade network so powerful. What had once been a single, coherent civilization operating under shared rules began to fragment into competing dynasties, rival caliphates, and regional powers, each with its own interests, its own currencies, its own commercial policies. And then came external shocks of devastating magnitude. The Crusades disrupted Mediterranean trade routes that had functioned smoothly for centuries. And then, in the 13th century, something truly catastrophic: the Mongol invasions. The destruction of Baghdad in 1258, the sack of the greatest city in the Islamic world, was not just a political or military event. It was an economic earthquake. Libraries burned. Scholars fled or died. Trading networks collapsed overnight. The infrastructure of centuries was dismantled in a matter of years. Trade routes shifted. Power began to move. And gradually, inexorably, the financial center of the world began to change. From east to west. By the late Middle Ages, European powers began to stir. Partly by necessity, cut off from Asian luxury goods, by the Ottoman Empire's control of overland routes, European explorers set out to find new paths. And, in doing so, they stumbled upon something that would change everything. New worlds, new resources, new trade routes that bypassed the old Islamic heartland entirely. But here's what most history books don't tell you. European merchants didn't reinvent finance from scratch. They borrowed. They adapted. They built on foundations that had been laid centuries earlier. The banking systems that emerged in Florence, Venice, and Genoa drew heavily on concepts and practices that had been developed in the Islamic world. Bills of exchange descended from the sakk. Partnership structures inspired by mudarabah. Risk-sharing arrangements, refinements of Islamic commercial law. Banking systems evolved, trade expanded, new global routes emerged. The balance of power had shifted. But here's the part most people don't realize. Many of the foundations of modern finance were already built centuries earlier, in the markets of Baghdad, in the ports of Basra, in the trade houses of Cairo and Córdoba. The names changed, the languages changed, the geography changed. But the underlying logic, the trust, the instruments, the risk-sharing, the networks, that was inherited. So why does any of this matter? Why should you, sitting here in the 21st century, care about medieval trade routes and 10th century financial instruments? Because this story reveals something that is as true today as it was 1,000 years ago. Financial dominance is never permanent. It shifts. It evolves. It follows innovation, trust, and stability. Every financial center that has ever dominated the global economy, Baghdad, Córdoba, Venice, Amsterdam, London, New York, was once a rising power. And every one of them eventually saw that power erode. Not always through defeat, not always through catastrophe, but through the slow, invisible process of losing competitive advantage, through complacency, through rigidity, through the failure to adapt. And today, we may be witnessing another shift. New financial centers are emerging. New currencies, digital, decentralized, are challenging the old order. New trade networks are being built that bypass the institutions that have dominated for decades. The specific actors are different, but the underlying dynamic is exactly the same as it was in the 10th century. The story of Islamic financial dominance isn't just history. It's a mirror that shows us how financial systems rise through innovation, through trust, through the courage to build something new, and how they fall through division, through rigidity, through the failure to see the changes coming. The systems we trust today, the dollar, the banking networks, the global financial architecture, these are not permanent fixtures of the universe. They are human creations, built on trust, sustained by innovation, and vulnerable to the same forces that brought down every financial empire that came before. And somewhere in the world, right now, a new financial center may already be rising. The question is, will we recognize it in time?